Hello, my name is Jonathan Rock, and this is my Wwise demo reel for the School of Videogame Audio. In this short video, I will demonstrate the techniques I use to design and implement the sound effects and music I created for Cube, using Audiokinetic's Wwise. Cube is an open-source first-person shooter with a dark atmosphere and a fast-paced tempo, very similar to the mechanics and flavor of Quake and Doom. The aesthetic of the levels involve winding metal and stone corridors, underwater tunnels, and frightening monsters and mutants that will pop out and attack you with reckless abandon. With that in mind, I needed to come up with a soundtrack that suits this theme in order to create the anxiety and driving tempo that this game is meant to convey. Now, before creating any sound assets, I had to begin by profiling my level in order to document all of the sounds, events, and switches that I would need to create and use. I then created a spreadsheet that details all of the sound effects and the events that they're tied to that I'm going to need to create. This allowed me to stay organized, stay on schedule, and carefully plan out all of my field recording excursions. My weapon sound design consists of a combination of stock library sounds for gunfire specifically, and mechanical Foley recorded from a good friend's gun collection. We recorded sounds such as rifle bolt actions and handgun slides opening and closing, dry fires, chambers loading and ejecting rounds from 5 different guns. Now, if you listen to an actual gunshot, the sound has 3 stages. The first pop, the first reflection, and a tail that follows. I applied this theory to my gun sound design by composing it in 3 layers. The punch, which gives the gun its initial pop, the body, which contains the first reflection and the tail, and the mechanical layer, which contains all of the gun's mechanical noise. In Cube, the rifle has one of the slowest firing rates, but it's also one of the most powerful guns. I wanted to have it sound like a thunderous crack that feels powerful and satisfying. For the rifle's punch layer, I used stock library sounds from a Winchester 1873 rifle, added a little bit of saturation for added presence. The rifle's body layer was based on a Browning 4570 rifle recording. I used Waves R-Bass to fatten up the low-end frequencies and FabFilter Saturn to give it a fuller sound that hits harder and accentuates the tail. For the mechanical layer of the rifle, I was going for the sound of the bolt action wobbling soon after being fired. I want it to sound especially metal and clanky because I want it to feel like an old weapon that's become a little bit rickety from use and age, but still gets the job done. 3 variations of punch, body, and mechanical sounds were created and placed into their own random container with subtle pitch randomization. And then all 3 random containers were placed in a blend container, so they will all trigger at the same time. The sounds of the rifle's bolt action and shotgun's pump action were also both placed in 2 random containers, and when played together will trigger a random bolt or pump open, followed by a random pump or bolt close sound, resulting in very organic and variable fire and reload sounds. The same technique of creating and blending together separate punch, body, and mechanical layers that simultaneously trigger random variations of each was used for the shotgun, chain gun, and of course, the rocket launcher. All voiceover was performed by myself and recorded at the Sound Matrix recording studio. I imitated the sounds of the player and monster's grunt, pain, and death sounds for each monster, and then used FX, such as Yuhi's granulator, in order to warp and pitch shift the voices. Each kind of sound was put in its own random container. For the player's pain sounds, I used a switch container with random containers that correspond to the player's remaining life. When the player is at his most healthy, he sounds the most tough and tolerant of the pain. But as his health decreases, his yelps sound increasingly strained and vulnerable. Most of the level in Cube that I featured is in winding metal and stone corridors and rooms. To create these acoustics, I use Wwise convolution reverb with impulse responses from abandoned military bunkers and storm drains, creating very metallic and claustrophobic acoustics that sound exactly like they look like they should. Because of the pacing of the game, I wanted the soundtrack to be driving, continuous, and primal with a dark and ominous atmosphere. In Cube, you seamlessly move from exploration to combat and back in what could be an instant, and so I wanted a soundtrack that seamlessly evolves between these states without a jarring transition from one song to a different song. To execute this, I started with a driving bass line that sets the ominous mood of the stage. I composed 7 8-bar sections, each with the same bass line and percussion, but with varying instrumentation and solos in each section. The percussive instruments in all sections are tied to an RTPC that modulates volume based on how much damage the player is taking. When the player is at full health, the percussion will be at its lowest, and when the player is near death, the percussion will be at its loudest. And so when the player is in his most dire moments, you're going to hear these driving primal drums that come in to emulate the beating heart of a person who's in such a dire situation. I wanted there to be a distinct changing in soundtrack during combat, but without interrupting the flow of the soundtrack, which is why each section contains a taiko drumming track that's muted when not in combat, and plays when combat's broken out, adding a layer of percussive action to the soundtrack, emulating guns firing. The music of the stage always starts with just the bass line for 4 bars, and then bass line and percussion modulated by health level for another 4 bars, and then transition to random containers that go back and forth interweaving a random melodic section using orchestral strings and a dulcimer, and a random haunting solo from a distorted pad. The soundtrack's bass line is intentionally repetitive, but with random containers transitioning to varying instrumentation and melodies, as well as health and combat affecting the presence of percussion. The result is a very adaptive and evolving non-repetitive soundtrack. The soundtrack finally has a dramatic transition when the boss has been reached, with percussion turning into hard industrial drum kits, and electric guitars taking over the bass line's melody to ramp up the intensity for the boss battle. Thank you for watching my Wwise demo reel.